Good evening. I'm delighted to be with you here tonight. And the subject of our discussion tonight, as you can see on the slide, is Mormonism and Evangelical Biblical Analysis. And I want to assure you at the outset that we're not here tonight to talk about the Mormon people. How many of you have Mormon friends or relatives? Sure you do. And you love them too, don't you? And of course God loves them, and I love them. You see, I love the Mormon people more today than I did when I was a Mormon. And there's a good reason for that. You see, when I was a Mormon, I did not realize that we were all lost. And now that I understand that all of my Mormon friends and relatives are lost, I have a very deep conviction in my heart for these people, and I would like to see them all saved. And of course, God would like to see them all saved also. For He tells us in His Word that He would not have even one to be lost. And He tells us again that He desires that all would be saved. So we're not here tonight to talk about the Mormon people, but we are going to talk about Mormon doctrines, and we're going to compare those doctrines with biblical doctrines, and we're going to relate that then to our eternal destiny. You see, when we were born into this world, not only were we born into the world, but we have been born into eternity. And having been born into eternity, the Bible tells us that when we die, and incidentally, we're all going to die, we'll be here for some 70 years or so, and then we're going to die, and our body is going to return to the dust from whence it came. And God says that when we die, our soul, our spirit, is going to live forever. And the Bible teaches that we will spend the remainder of eternity either in heaven with God or separated from God in a place that the Bible calls hell. Now, you can go to many a church in this country today. You can spend your entire life in some churches, and you will never hear the word hell ever mentioned. But I am here to tell you that the Bible clearly teaches that there is a heaven and there is a hell. And when you die, you will go either to heaven or you will go to hell, and you will spend the remainder of eternity either with God or separated from God. With that in mind then, what we intend to talk about here today is our eternal destiny. My Mormon friends and my Mormon relatives always say to me when I make a presentation of this kind, they say, "Why do you want to go around talking about the Mormon people? Why don't you go talk about other folks? Or if you really want to know something about Mormon doctrine, then why don't you call in some of the Mormon elders and have the Mormon elders present something to you?" Well, I do this simply because God has directed me to do so. Not only has He directed me to do so, but He has directed every Christian to do so. If you will examine the Bible in Jude 3, God has instructed every one of us that we are exhorted that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. Now that word faith is really talking about God's Word. And a very literal interpretation of this scripture then would be that we have been exhorted to earnestly contend for God's Word, which was once for all time delivered unto the saints. In addition to that, the second president of the Mormon Church, Brigham Young, challenged all Christians to do the same thing. This is what he said in the Journal of Discourses. He said, "I say to the whole world, receive the truth no matter who presents it to you, take up the Bible, compare the religion of the Latter-day Saints with it, and see if it will stand the test." And of course, Jesus Himself charged every Christian with the responsibility of carrying the gospel to the entire world. These then are the reasons that we are going to compare Mormon doctrine with biblical doctrine to see if it will stand the test. We do not intend here this day to talk about the Mormon people. We're going to talk about doctrines, and then we're going to relate the effect of those doctrines on our eternal destiny. What then is the overall goal of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Their current president, Spencer W. Kimball, has stated the goal for us, and it was published in the Church News, which incidentally is a weekly magazine that is published by the church in Salt Lake City. And every one of these articles that I show you referring to the Church News comes directly from their editorial section. And all of the editorial articles that I point out to you were written by one individual, one of their 12 apostles. And we'll be referring to the Church News throughout this entire presentation. Spencer Kimball said that the goal of the Mormon Church is as stated here. Our message is to bring light into the world and our charge to convert the people of the world to accept the truth. That is what we want, the total membership of all the world as indicated by the Lord. They fully intend to proselyte every one of you here in this room, all of your friends and all of your relatives into the Mormon Church. Now, it would not be at all unusual if there were some Mormon missionaries right now, this very minute, knocking at the door of one of your friends or of one of your relatives, trying to proselyte them into Mormonism. They fully intend to proselyte everyone in the world into Mormonism, both the living and the dead. In order to accomplish that mission, they claim that they are the saviors of the world. John Taylor, who later became the third president of the Mormon Church, stated that we are the only people that know how to save our progenitors, how to save ourselves, and how to save our posterity in the celestial kingdom of God. We, in fact, are the saviors of the world. Now, the Mormons today have over 28,000 full-time missionaries operating throughout the world today. In addition to that, every Mormon is charged with the responsibility of proselyting all of their friends and all of their relatives who are not Mormons into Mormonism. That is an absolute requirement on every Mormon if he is practicing the religion that they indeed do teach. The question that you and I should present to one another then, if the Mormons are indeed the saviors of the world, and if we are concerned with our eternal destiny, then we should know something about the doctrines that they teach so that we can render an intelligent decision on the basis of their doctrines to determine what effect it might have on our eternal destiny. With this in mind then, the question that you should have at about this time would go something like this. If I join the Mormon Church, and if I practice all of their doctrines very faithfully, will I indeed go to heaven? And I propose to you that at the conclusion of this presentation, you will be able to answer this question for yourself. I think before we get into a very detailed discussion of the Mormon doctrines, it might be well if we take just a few moments to talk about some of the historical background of Mormonism, where it originated, and some of the factors that had an effect on Joseph Smith, who claimed that he had been appointed by God as a prophet, seer, and revelator. He said that he received revelations from God on a daily basis, and the Mormons then used these revelations to govern the church. Now, they claim that each of his successor, each president of the Mormon Church, including the current president, Spencer Kimball, receive revelations on a daily basis from God, and they then use these revelations to govern the church. With that in mind then, let's examine some of the historical background relating to Joseph Smith and the origin of Mormonism, because you see, some of the events that happened in Joseph Smith's life do indeed have an effect on some of the doctrines that we're going to be talking about here today. You see, we're all basically a product of our background. And the events that happen to us throughout our life do indeed have a bearing on some of the events that happen and some of the thoughts that we produce later on in life. With this in mind then, let's examine some of the historical background. Joseph Smith was born in Sharon, Vermont in 1805. He was the third child in a family of 9 children. His father was a farmer and a part-time school teacher. And when Joseph Smith was 10 years old, they moved from Sharon, Vermont to the vicinity of Palmyra, New York. Now, Palmyra, New York is located in the western part of New York. It's approximately 20 to 30 miles almost directly east of Rochester, New York, in the Finger Lake regions of New York. The Smiths purchased a farm in this area, and of course they were not very wealthy. They were poor. So it was necessary for the boys, as they were growing up then, to help to provide support for the family by finding whatever kind of jobs they could find. I want to point out several areas that we'll be talking about at a later time. Now, Fayette, New York is located in this area, and in 1830 the Book of Mormon was published in Fayette, New York. Bainbridge, New York is a town that I want you to remember because a very important event took place there in 1826. And some important events happened in the vicinity of Harmony, Pennsylvania in the 1829-1830 time frames. As a matter of fact, Joseph Smith met his future wife in Harmony, Pennsylvania. At the time the Smiths moved to Palmyra, the Erie Canal was under construction. And of course you have to understand that this brought in a great influx of migrant laborers and the normal events that transpire with this kind of activity. The Erie Canal, as a matter of fact, runs right through the city of Palmyra, New York. The Book of Mormon then was published in 1830, and in the 1832 time frame, Joseph Smith and the Mormons who were following him moved to Kirtland, Ohio in the 1832 time frame, and they remained there through 1838. They sent some advanced people out to some missionaries out to Independence, Missouri in 1831. And then in 1838, the main body of Mormons moved to the Missouri area, where they established a settlement that was known as Far West. That's just a little north of, I would say maybe between 50 and 100 miles north of Kansas City, Missouri, in western Missouri. An important event happened in 1838 in a place that Joseph Smith called Adam-on-Ammon. Joseph Smith, at that time in Adam-on-Ammon, identified this pile of rocks that you see here as the very place where Adam built an altar, and he then provided sacrifices and worshiped God through sacrificial offerings by these very stones. Now, I went back to Adam-on-Ammon because I wanted to get a colored photograph of this. This photograph was taken from one of the Mormon books that were published, and I wanted a more recent photo of this, so I went and I looked for this location. I couldn't find it. I spent an entire afternoon looking for it. When I went back to the original starting point where they have a map which supposedly gives you directions where you can find these various locations, I encountered a Mormon man there, and he asked me whether or not I was able to find the altar site, and I told him that I had not. And he told me that he had been there this was his second trip. He had been there the year previous, and that he had never been able to find this site. Now, this site has been in the possession of the Mormon Church from the time that this photograph was taken. And yet, myself and the other individual who came to look for this site couldn't find it. Now, you would think that if this was indeed the very place where Adam worshiped God, and that these rocks were used as an altar, that this then would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries that the world has ever known. And yet, we can't even find this today. As a matter of fact, the Mormon Church is doing absolutely no archaeological work in this area at all. Their archaeological work is being conducted in Mexico, where the people live that we know inhabited the North and South American continents many years ago. I would point out to you that the Mormons also teach that the Garden of Eden was located in the United States, and for the most part they claim that that location was somewhere in the Carolinas area. And Joseph Smith said that the very place that Cain killed Abel was in the vicinity of Far West in Missouri. Now, if you examine the Bible very clearly points out that the Garden of Eden was located somewhere near the headwaters of both the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And if you examine all of Joseph Smith's works, he also identifies this as the location of the Garden of Eden, with the exception of his statement in 1838, in which he said that the Garden of Eden was located in the United States. Now, it's not at all unusual to run into these kind of contradictions. You see, because it's a changing doctrine. They receive revelations supposedly on a daily basis from God, and as a result, they change these doctrines, and it is very essential then that you know what the original doctrines were, and you have to compare those doctrines with the doctrines that they're teaching today, so that you can then determine for yourself whether or not these are valid changes made by God. Because you see, both the Bible and the Book of Mormon and also the Doctrine and Covenants also teach that God never changes from anything that He has ever said. All of this in spite of the fact that when you examine their doctrines you find all of these changes. In 1838 the Mormons were driven out of Missouri, and they then located their next headquarters in Nauvoo, Illinois in 1839. Now, during the early 1840 time frame, Nauvoo, Illinois became the largest city in Illinois. At that time in history, they had over 20,000 people, and at that same time, the city of Chicago had a population of only 5,000. So it was at that time in history the largest city in Illinois, and of course Joseph Smith ruled the city with an iron fist. Joseph Smith was killed in 1844 in Carthage, Illinois, and then in 1846, under the leadership of Brigham Young, the Mormons moved from Nauvoo, Illinois, through Iowa out to the Utah Territory. After Joseph Smith died, there were several break-offs from the church, and a number of people established independent churches of their own, supposedly under the direct leadership of God, and they all claimed that they received revelations, and then they went their own way. The largest of these groups, and the second largest today, is the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their headquarters is in Independence, Missouri. Just before Joseph Smith died, he issued a patriarchal blessing to his son, in which he stated that God had turned over the leadership of the Mormon Church to him, and that he was to succeed Joseph Smith in the event Joseph Smith died. Well, he was a very young boy at the time this happened, and the leadership did not pass on to him. The leadership passed on to Brigham Young, and he never became the president of the church in Salt Lake City. But another group established the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they later installed him as their president, and up to this point in time, their president has always been a direct descendant in the male line of Joseph Smith. Now, in the past couple of years, they've encountered a few problems. They no longer have a male heir. So within the last 2 years, their current president issued a revelation in which he stated that it would be okay for women to now hold the priesthood. And of course you can understand what's happening. He's essentially laying the groundwork so that even though it is a female, she then will carry on the lineage of Joseph Smith through the leadership of the reorganized church. One of the problems that the people were faced with in the early 1800s had to do with the origin of the American Indians. You see, they did not know where the Indians originated from. Now, there were several theories having to do with the origin of the American Indians, but they did not have the archaeological data available to them at that time that you and I have to us today. And as a result of that, there were several major theories that were being taught in the schools and by many of the prominent scholars of that day and some of the religious leaders of that day that had to do with the origin of the American Indians. You see, at that time in history, the American Indians used to gather their dead once each year, and they would then place them in a common burial ground, and they would then bury them in a common burial ground. Now, this is a picture that I took from a history book, and it depicts what a burial mound would look like. Now, the National Geographic magazine did an excellent article on the Indian mounds in the Mississippi Valley several years ago, and if some of you are interested in looking for that, you can find that in most any of the public libraries, and particularly in the larger libraries. And these Indian mounds were located throughout the Mississippi Valley. They also extended north up the Ohio Valley as far north as western New York, the area where Joseph Smith lived. Now, if you were to take one of those Indian mounds and cut it away, such as this photograph depicts, you would see then that the Indians would bury their dead along with all of their artifacts in a common burial mound. And the theory was at that time that the savages that the people were meeting on the western frontier did not have the cultural background to produce some of the artifacts that they were uncovering. Now, as a result of this, they arrived at a theory that was being taught at that time that a very highly cultured, peaceful race of people were living on the North and South American continent, and that a very savage, warlike group then came in. They completely killed off all of the peaceful, highly cultured race, and the only people remaining then on the North and South American continent in the early 1800s were these savage Indians that they were encountering. Now, many of the prominent scholars were teaching this theory. As a matter of fact, William Henry Harrison, just before he became the President of the United States, wrote a book in which he stated that the last great battle between these savages and the highly cultured people took place on the banks of the Ohio River. Now, also tied into this cultural theory was another theory that we will just call the 10 Lost Tribes theory. There were a number of prominent preachers in that day who were teaching that this savage group of people that destroyed the highly cultured race came from the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel. And of course, people like William Penn, Roger Williams, Cotton Mather, and Jonathan Edwards, among others, were all teaching this theory. So you see, these theories came about because they really did not have enough evidence to determine the origin of the American Indians. Now, many other things were happening in the New York area at that time also. There was an individual by the name of Walters, while Joseph Smith was a small boy. And this individual claimed that he could find buried treasures, and he used divining rods and stuffed toads and things of this nature, crystal, in order to find buried treasure. He claimed that he could find buried treasure, and people actually paid him money to do so. Well, it was discovered that he was a fraud, and he left the area, and it seems that after he left the area, Joseph Smith became involved in these type of activities. Joseph and his brother were digging a well for a farmer in the nearby area one day, and they uncovered a very peculiar rock. Now, they initially gave the rock to the family's wife, to the husband's wife, but they then later went back and borrowed the rock. Joseph Smith would use this rock to hunt for buried treasure. He would take this rock and he would put it in a hat, and he then would bury his face in the hat and he supposedly then would get directions through the rock where they could find buried treasures. Now, he participated in these kind of activities, and he actually received money for doing so. On one occasion, he directed that the people he was working for were to take a black sheep, and they were to slit its throat and lead it around in a circle while its throat was bleeding, and thereby leaving a trail of blood in a circle to keep the evil spirits out, while Joseph Smith, with the rock in the hat, his face in the hat, directed people where to dig for buried treasures. Now, on another occasion, he directed that they should drive some stakes in the ground in a circle, and then he put an individual to walk around the circle with a sword to keep the evil spirits out, while Joseph Smith, with the rock in the hat, his face in the hat, directed people where to dig for buried treasures. Now, the Mormon Church claims that Joseph Smith never did participate in these kind of activities. As a matter of fact, they have gone on record as stating that if this could ever be proven, then of course it would totally destroy the groundwork of the Mormon Church. There was an individual, a Methodist pastor named Wesley Walters. He went back to the New York area and he started researching all of the records, because the Mormons claimed Joseph Smith had never participated in these kind of activities. And in his research, he uncovered a court document, and this is a copy of that court document, in which it states that the people of New York versus Joseph Smith, and notice now he's called the Glass Looker, and it is dated on March the 20th of 1826. Now, this took place in Bainbridge, New York. Remember, I told you to remember the location of Bainbridge, New York. It was in a Justice of the Peace Court. It was only a misdemeanor, but he was indeed found guilty of participating in these kind of activities. Now, many other things were happening in the New York area in the early 1800s also. The big revivals, the religious revivals that were being held in the Kentucky area were winding down, and many of them were starting to pick up in the western New York area. Now, many of these activities took place within walking distance of the Smith farm. As an example, Ann Lee originated the Shakers at about this time. She claimed to be the reincarnated Christ, and she of course governed her people by revelations, and they practiced communal type living. There was an individual by the name of Isaac Bullard. He started an organization that was known as the Pilgrims. They started in the Vermont area, very close to the area where Joseph Smith grew up, and they then passed down through western New York, and they took the same trails that Joseph and his family took to come to New York, and they eventually settled in the Ohio Valley. Now, this fellow would run around with a bear skin and nothing else. He didn't believe in bathing, and they practiced communal type living also. Now, another group known as the Universal Friends were organized by a woman, Jemima Wilkerson. Now, she claimed also to be the reincarnated Christ. She governed her people by revelations, and she had a man who claimed to be a prophet, and he would tie a belt around his stomach, and he would tie it so tight and leave it there until his stomach would swell up, and then he would issue prophetic utterances. Now, the Baptists during this time in history split several ways. They split into the Reformed Baptists, the Hard Shell Baptists, the Seventh-day Baptists. They also had the Free Will Baptists and the Foot Washers, among others, at that period of time. And of course, the Methodists from 1814 until 1830 divided into 4 different groups. So there was a lot of religious activity that was taking place within walking distance of Joseph Smith's household, and of course all of these activities had a bearing on some of the thoughts that went through Joseph Smith's mind at that time. Now, Joseph Smith claimed that there was a religious revival. He really said that there was some religious excitement in the area, and this would be classified as a revival. It was a common revival. All of the people in Elmira came to the one common revival, And following the revival, Joseph Smith said that there was fighting and bickering between the various denominations to see who could get the converts that had been converted as a result of this revival. And he mentions specifically the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians in this. He said that this confused him and he just did not know which church to join. He said that he was reading in the Bible one day and he looked at James 1:5 and he found that any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given to him. Joseph, as a result of this, said that he went into the woods to pray, and while he was in the act of praying to God, both God and Jesus appeared to him. And God told Joseph at this time that he was to join none of these religions, for they were all an abomination in the sight of God, and Joseph was not to join any of them, but that God would provide him with additional information at a later date. Now, Joseph Smith didn't tell anybody about this vision until 1838 that we know of. It was in 1838 that Joseph dictated what happened in that very first vision. It was not published until 1842, some 22 years after the event occurred. Joseph said that he was 14 years old. Now, if he was 14 years old, that means that it would have been in the 1820 time frame that he saw God. He said that both God and Jesus had appeared to him and had told him that all churches were wrong. Now, many people did not believe this story of Joseph Smith, and many people have, over the years, tried to disprove that Joseph Smith ever saw God and Jesus. By the same token, many Mormons have, throughout the years, been trying to prove that this indeed did happen, because this is the basis that the Mormon Church uses to prove that God and Jesus are two separate, distinct personages. They say they know this because Joseph Smith did indeed see both God and Jesus. There was a student, his name was Paul Chessman at Brigham Young University, and he was working on a master's thesis. He was trying to prove this vision. He requested permission from the church authorities to research the historical archives. They gave him permission to do so, and in his research he uncovered another version. Now, in this version, which was dictated, and portions of it now in Joseph Smith's own handwriting, it was either in 1831 or 1832. Now, the Mormon Church has now pretty well tied down the 1832 time frame. There's no date as such on the paper, but other events that are listed in the paper place it in the 1832 time frame. In this paper, Joseph stated that he was 16 years old, that only Jesus had appeared to him, and that by searching the Bible, he had found that all religions were wrong. Now, here you have one man who claims to have had a vision, and when he tells us the story of what happened, we have two different versions of what happened. Not only do we have two different versions, but another version was uncovered, and that was dictated by Joseph Smith in 1835. And in this version, he stated that he was 14 years old, that two personages and many angels had appeared to him. Now, here is a man who said he saw God and he saw Jesus, and when he tells us about this event, he gives us three different versions, completely and totally different versions of what he said he saw. Now, I present to you a question. If you saw God and if you saw Jesus when you were 14 years old, do you think that you would come up with three different versions such as Joseph Smith had? Now, there have been additional research very recently, and as a result of this research, researchers have found that there are as many as 9 different versions of Joseph Smith's first vision. When we read the history of the church, which is dated on the 29th of May in 1852, and this incidentally was written by Joseph Smith, Joseph said, "I received the first visitation of angels, which was when I was about 14 years old." Now you'll notice that that is another version. But when you read the history of the church today, they have changed this, and they've changed it to conform with Joseph Smith's story of his first story, because they want to use this, of course, to prove that God and Jesus are indeed two separate people. And if you read it today, this is the way it reads. "I received my first vision, which was when I was about 14 years old." Now, the church does this regularly. It's not at all unusual for them to make changes. As a matter of fact, that's why it's necessary for you to check all of the latest documents, and then you have to go back to the original documents and research them to find out these various changes that they've made. You find it in every one of their books and in every one of their editions when they put out new editions. Their ninth president, David O. McKay, said that the appearing of the Father and Son to Joseph Smith is the very foundation of this church. Well, if the fact that Joseph Smith saw God and Jesus is the very foundation of the church, then let's examine that foundation on the basis of what the Bible teaches to determine just how solid that foundation really is. So we turn to the Bible, and in Exodus 33:20, you'll recall that Moses had an encounter with God, and this is what God said to Moses. God said, "Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live." And if we go to the New Testament in John 1:18, God tells us that no man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. And again in the New Testament, in 1 Timothy 6:16, God tells us that God, who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen, nor can see, to whom be honor and power everlasting. According to the Bible, Joseph Smith could not have seen God and lived. Now you'll have to bear in mind that we don't have time to point out all of the scriptures to you from the Bible on a specific subject, and by the same token, we don't have enough time to list all of the Mormon scripture on a specific subject. But bear in mind that in every case there is additional biblical documentation, and I'm sure that many of you are aware of that, and by the same token there is additional Mormon documentation to prove each one of these doctrinal points. I'm just showing you some representative examples to establish the point that I want to make. If we go to the Doctrine and Covenants, in September of 1832, in the 84th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith received a revelation from God, and this is what God told him. God said that without the Mormon ordinances and the authority of the Mormon priesthood, the power of godliness is not manifest unto men in the flesh. For without this, no man can see the face of God, even the Father, and live. According to Joseph Smith's own revelation, no man can see the face of God and live unless he holds the Mormon priesthoods. Now, Joseph Smith did not receive the Mormon priesthoods, according to his own statements, until 1829. He claims that he saw God and Jesus in 1820. So according to his own revelation, if he had seen God, he would have died. It was some 3 years later, on the 21st of September of 1823, that he claims an angel appeared to him in his room one night, and now this angel is going to provide him with the additional information that God had promised him some 3 years earlier. This angel appeared to Joseph Smith in his room, and this is what the angel told him. He said there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of this continent and the source from whence they sprang. Joseph Smith is now going to get the answer concerning the Indians on the North and South American continents and where they came from. Now, he also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it as delivered by the Savior to the ancient inhabitants. Now, what does the fullness of the everlasting gospel mean to you? To me, it means everything. You don't need anything else. And I want you to keep that in mind as we continue on with our discussion, because not only do the Mormons use the Book of Mormon, but they also have 5 other sources that they use. And of course, we then must refer back to what the angel told Joseph Smith when he said that it contained the fullness of the everlasting gospel. Along with the golden, of course he told him that they were located on golden plates and that it was written in Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics. And he said that located along with the golden plates was what he called a Urim and a Thummim, and they were attached to a breastplate. Now the Urim and a Thummim was something similar to a pair of spectacles, and the angel told Joseph Smith that if he were to use these, he would then be able to translate and interpret the Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics that were written on the golden plates. Now Joseph Smith claimed that he did so. The angel appeared to him 3 times that night. And then the following morning, Joseph Smith went out into the field to work with his father. But because he had been kept up all night by the angel, he said that he told his father about what had happened the night before. He was totally exhausted, so his father told him to return to the house and get some rest. So he started home, and in crossing a fence, he became so exhausted that he passed out. And when he awakened, the angel appeared to him one more time, and the angel explained to him once again where he could find the golden plates. So he said he knew this location because he had been there before, and this is an early photograph of the Hill Cumorah. This is the place that Joseph Smith claimed contained the golden plates. He said he went to this location, and that by using a stick as a pry, he placed this stick underneath a rock and raised up the rock, and in the rock was a container that contained the golden plates. At about that time, the angel appeared to Joseph Smith, and he informed Joseph that he could not take those plates home. He said that he could not have the plates for 4 years, but that he was to come back to this location on the anniversary date, which would then be the 22nd of September, each year for 4 years. And Joseph Smith claimed that he did so. Now, how then, in 1827, Joseph Smith was given the plates, and he supposedly translated the Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics on the golden plates into the Book of Mormon. The question that we have at this time is, as I have shown it here, is there a correlation between the early theories concerning the American Indians and the Book of Mormon history? Now you recall I pointed out to you that the angel said that it contained a history and the background of the former inhabitants of the North and South American continent. So let's take a look at the Book of Mormon, the contents of the Book of Mormon, to see whether or not there is a correlation. We have to go to the last book in the Book of Mormon to start the history, because the last book gives us the earliest history of the inhabitants of the North and South American continent. Now, it is known as the Book of Ether, and it talks about a group of people who were called the Jaredites. At the time that God was going to confound the languages of the people at the Tower of Babel, it seems that Jared learned somehow or other that God was going to confound their languages. So he went to his brother, who was apparently a prophet of God at that time, and requested his brother to appeal to God and ask God not to confound their languages. The brother went to God, God honored the request, and he told them to move out into the wilderness. And he permitted them, both they and their families, and 12 of their friends and 22 of their friends and their families, and God instructed them to go out into the wilderness. When they arrived in the wilderness, God told them how to build 8 ships. They built these 8 ships, and then they sailed across the ocean, and they landed specifically on the North American continent. When they arrived on the North American continent, then they, of course, they settled, they established a colony, and the population rose. As a matter of fact, the Book of Mormon says that the population became so immense that they were numbered as many as we can find in the sands of the seas. So apparently there were quite a number of people. Now, many events happened between these people. It seems that they divided into two factions, and they started off by just having arguments between one another, but as the population increased, this grew into wars. And of course, the Book of Mormon teaches that these people produced swords of fine steel. They had all kinds of precious metals. They had silk and fine linen. And of course, we then should be able to find some of these swords of fine steel, because the Book of Mormon tells us precisely where the last great battle between these people took place. You see, they continued to battle one another until about the 600 BC time frame. And then the Book of Mormon says that there was one last great battle in which these people completely annihilated one another. Now, if they're going to annihilate one another, then of course they had very crude weapons of war, and because of that, for that reason alone, they would have to have an equal number of people on both sides, at least at the beginning, or at least an approximate number, if they're going to end up killing one another off. The Mormons say that this was a very primitive society, and certainly we're not going to find very much in the way of archaeological evidence. But let's turn to the Book of Mormon itself and see how many people the Book of Mormon talks about. In Ether 14:21, it says that the whole face of the land was covered with the bodies of the dead. And then, speaking now of the leader of the righteous people, whose name was Coriantumr, he saw that there had been slain by sword already nearly 2 millions of his people. 2 millions of mighty men, and also their wives and their children. Now, as I explained, if these two factions are going to end up killing one another off, they have to start at a relatively even number of people. So on one side alone, we're talking about 2 million fighting men along with their families. Now, let's just assume that they had a family of what? Some 2 or 3 people, maybe 4. We're talking anywhere from 6 to 8 million people on one side. And if they're going to completely annihilate one another, you have to start with pretty much an equal number, so you're talking about anywhere from 12 to 16 million people. In addition to that, after this battle took place, they then took 4 years in which they gathered all of the people, and they then had one last great battle where they then killed everyone off, with the exception of the leader of the righteous people, whose name was Coriantumr. And it says that Coriantumr was very severely wounded, but he lived with another group of people for a period of 9 moons. Now, the book does not specify what time frame 9 moons would be, but having been severely wounded, we can assume that it would not have been a very long period of time. So only one individual then, according to the Book of Mormon, remained living from this group of people, and his name was Coriantumr. Then when we go to the Book of Mormon, we find another group of people, and they are known as the Nephites and the Lamanites. There was a prophet named Lehi living in Jerusalem at the time that Jeremiah was prophesying. Now, Lehi, apparently, according to the Book of Mormon at least, was prophesying the same fate for the people of Judah that Jeremiah was prophesying. And the Book of Mormon says that the people threatened his life, so he prayed to God, and God told him to take his family and move out into the wilderness. He supposedly did this. They moved from Jerusalem to the northern end of the Sea of Aqaba, and it seems that they had failed to bring the family records along with them into the wilderness. The family records were being held by an uncle back in Jerusalem. So the father sent his 3 sons, Nephi, Laman, and Lemuel, back
to pick up the records. They went to Uncle Laban and they asked him for the records. He refused to give them to them. But they remembered that all of their father's precious goods were still in Jerusalem because they moved out in such a hurry they didn't take any of them with them. So they then took these precious goods and sold them. They went back to Uncle Laban and they tried to buy the records from him. Well, he would not give them the records, but he drove them out of Jerusalem. That night, the youngest of the three sons, Nephi, went back into Jerusalem, and he found Uncle Laban in a drunken stupor. So he picked up Uncle Laban's sword and he cut his head off. He then procured the records, and he took not only the records, but a servant of his uncle whose name was Zoram. They went then back into the wilderness. When they got back to the wilderness, they had another problem. All they had in the family of Lehi were boys. So they had to get some girls so that the boys could marry and continue the propagation. They sent the three boys back to Jerusalem, where they picked up a family known as Ishmael and his family. Now he had a family of girls and two older boys who were already married. So they then joined Lehi and his family, so now we have two families plus the servant of Zoram. And once again, God tells them how to build a ship. He tells Nephi, the third oldest of the three boys at that time, how to build a ship. And he then built a ship. They then sailed in that ship. Now we have a similar process that we had in the book of Ether, but they're sailing only in one ship in this case. They sailed through the Red Sea, through the Indian Ocean, into the Pacific Ocean, and they landed specifically in Colombia, South America. Now, how do we know they landed there? Joseph Smith told us. In the Times and Seasons, on September 15th of 1842, and incidentally, the Times and Seasons is a Mormon publication. Joseph Smith said that Lehi went down by the Red Sea to the Great Southern Ocean and crossed over to this land, and he landed a little south of the Isthmus of Darien and improved the country according to the word of the Lord. Now, the Isthmus of Darien is located in what is known today as Panama. And if you go just as a matter of fact, it is in southern Panama, and it is adjacent to what is known as Colombia, South America today. So we know precisely then where they landed. Now, we want to point this out to you because the Book of Mormon supposedly is a history. And if this is where the people were, then we ought to be able to do some archaeological work down there and discover some of the materials that the Book of Mormon claims that they used. But you see, the Mormons are not digging down here because there are no people that were living here and they can't find any archaeological evidence. So they have moved into Mexico and they're doing their archaeological work in Mexico, and some of the Mormon apologists claim that they have come up with what they call the Tehuantepec theory. And in the Tehuantepec theory, they've picked out another narrow neck of land, and they say that this narrow neck of land is in Mexico, and this, of course, is where some people were living, and that's where they're doing their archaeological work today. Having landed on the North and South American continent, we have the same kind of problem occurring here between the Nephites and the Lamanites. It seems that the older brothers were jealous of the younger brother, and as a result, they were constantly striving with one another. Now, as the population grew, this developed into the same kind of thing that we had with the Jaredites. It developed into wars. And the Book of Mormon says that Laman and Lemuel and the two sons of Ishmael were the wicked people, and they became so wicked that God cursed them, and he cursed them with a skin of blackness. And the reason for that curse, according to the Book of Mormon, was to prevent the Nephites from having any association of any kind with the Lamanites. So these two groups split, and they're known even today as the Lamanites and the Nephites. Now remember that they are all Jews, but some of these Jews now have been cursed with a black skin, and some of them have a white skin. They then separated, but throughout the entire period of the Book of Mormon that we're talking about, these wars continued between these two groups of people, the Lamanites and the Nephites. It seems that a short time later, now this depicts the Nephites and the Lamanites, showing you that they were Jews. They were all white Jews to begin with. But then God cursed the Lamanites. Now they're still all Jews, but now we have white Jews and black Jews, but they all are Jews. And I want you to remember that because it's very important, and we're going to talk about that more at a later point in our discussion. It seems that the Nephites came across another group of people, and they are known as the Mulekites. Now the Book of Mormon says that the Mulekites came to this continent shortly after the Jews were taken into captivity, shortly after 600 BC, when the Jews were taken into Babylonian captivity. The Book of Mormon says that a group of people under the leadership of the infant son, actually he was not their leader at that time, but it says the leader eventually, who eventually became their leader, was Mulek, and the Book of Mormon says that he was the infant son of King Zedekiah. Now you recall that the Bible, both in Jeremiah and in 2 Kings, teach us that after the Jews were captured by the Babylonians, that the Babylonians took King Zedekiah, they killed his sons before his eyes, and they then blinded him and took him into captivity. So what we have here then is a total contradiction to biblical teachings. The Mormons, however, don't pay any attention to that. They say that Coriantumr joined these Mulekites and he lived with them for a period of 9 moons. Now they uncovered records with the Mulekites which then gave them the history of the Jaredites, supposedly, and these were written also on metal plates. These two groups then amalgamated under the leadership of the Nephites, and they then lived together, but the wars between the Lamanites and the Nephites continued throughout this historical period. Then there comes a time in the Book of Mormon history where some of the Lamanites, not all of them, but a group of the Lamanites, came to the aid of some of the Nephites. And this pleased God, and so God removed the curse from them, and he made them once again a white and delightsome people. And then if you read the Book of Mormon farther, it says that shortly after the American Indians, who incidentally are the so-called black-skinned Lamanites, it says that after the American Indians become Mormons, after several generations of being Mormons, the scales of darkness is going to fall from their skins, and they're going to become once again a white and delightsome people.